Good evening, and welcome to our second Visionary Conversations event of 2014. And for the 2013-2014 series, we'd announced to you in advance a number of topics, but we'd left two topics open to see what developed locally and around the world. And this is the second of our two open sessions. My name is David Barnard, President and Vice Chancellor of the University of Manitoba, and your host for this evening. We're here tonight in Treaty 1 territory, on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe peoples and the homeland of the Métis Nation. This university and the forks of the city really are at the crossroads of the Anishinaabe, Métis, Cree, Dakota, and Oji-Cree nations. So we're more than halfway through this year's series of Visionary Conversations. And for those who have joined us this season, you'll know that we have a new partner, CBC Information Radio. So please join me in welcoming Terry McLeod, who's here sitting in the front, host of CBC Information Radio's weekend show. Terry will be monitoring social media tonight and will supply us with some questions during the conversation period. Tonight we want to explore the legacy of Nelson Mandela by looking at race and ethnic relations around the world and here at home. Our topic is, what have we learned from Mandela? The legacy that he left is well known around the world, at least in part. His courage, his fearlessness, these are inspiring as we face the continued persecution of ethnic and cultural groups in many countries, including our own. We're fortunate to be joined by alumni, friends of this community, and our distinguished scholars who will explore the complexities of our topic this evening. And as is always the case, you as members of the audience are important contributors to the discussion, and your input will shape the conversation. So each of our panelists will talk for about 5 minutes to comment on the theme. They won't answer all your questions, but they may provoke some. And after the panelists have spoken, I'll open the floor for comments and questions. Colleagues with wireless microphones will circulate around the room, and I would ask that you wait until one of my colleagues gets to you with a microphone when you have a question, because we want to be able to record them. I would also ask that you make your comments brief and your questions clearly stated. We want to get to as many audience members as possible as we have a limited amount of time. I always have in my notes an announcement that you can follow our conversation on Twitter at the hashtag #UMVisionary. Or you can just pay attention and see what's happening for yourself. We'll wind up the discussion just before 8:30, and so now it's my privilege to introduce the first speaker from our panel. Our first speaker is Dr. Joy Chadha, who is a professor of history in the Faculty of Arts. Her research centers on the connection between social inequality and access to basic human rights in Zimbabwe. Joy has extensive knowledge of South African history and social changes. She teaches several courses on South African history, including one on South Africa from Jan van Riebeeck to Nelson Mandela here at the university. Joy has published on migrant elderly farm workers, sexual abuse, gender and nationalism, war-induced internal displacement, the African diaspora, and the Zimbabwean funerary industry. Her forthcoming book, To Be Tolerated Only in Invisibility, Remembering the Zimbabwean Liberation War as Displaced Women in Hostile Colonial Harare, 1974 to 1980, traces the trajectory of women and children forced to relocate from war-torn rural Zimbabwe to the capital, where they were envisaged as trespassing Africans in a segregated urban space designated white. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Joy Chadha.
Thank you. My talk is laced with excerpts from Mandela's speeches because I want him to talk for himself and for us to remember what the man represented by listening to his own words. I'll start off by giving you a quotation from Mandela's final court statement, which he gave in Pretoria in 1962. The white man makes all the laws. He drags us to his courts and accuses us, and he sits in judgment over us. Why is that in this courtroom I face a white magistrate, am confronted by a white prosecutor, and escorted into the dock by a white orderly? Can anyone honestly and seriously suggest that in this type of environment, the scales of justice are evenly balanced? Then, of course, there is the famous 1964 speech from the dog. During my lifetime, I've dedicated myself to the struggle of the African people. I have fought against white domination, and I fought against black domination. I've cherished the idea of a democratic and free society in which all persons will live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal for which I hope to live for and to see realized. But, my Lord, if needs be, it is a right for which I'm prepared to die. For the next 27 years, Mandela was incarcerated in prison. Over time, he became the global icon of the anti-apartheid struggle. His speeches from 1994 before 94 remind us that ultimately racism is not just race or skin pigmentation. It is about what race represents. In South Africa, whiteness was not only a color but a privilege. It was about inclusionary and exclusionary politics at the expense of blacks. Indeed, blacks were ultimately fighting for equal access to resources, human rights, and above all, dignity. The right to not be dehumanized, what Ames Isaiah called thingification. But what we should also remember is that the anti-apartheid struggle was also a struggle to free the white South Africans from fear, because apartheid itself was a policy that emanated from the position of fear of black numerical superiority and what that would represent in a democratic society. Moving forward, South Africa needs to address the yawning gap of inequality that exists in the country. In retrospect, attaining democracy is probably easier than addressing the apartheid-created imbalances. While during the anti-apartheid struggle, South Africans galvanized international support against racism, this next struggle on inequality is something that South Africa largely has to do alone. Without addressing the inequality, South Africa will continue to be riddled with violence that has witnessed the death of many South Africans, both black and white. The inequality in social services that has witnessed thousands of people, particularly blacks, die from diseases that they don't have to die from, such as HIV/AIDS. Gender inequality that has given South Africa the unenviable position of having the worst rape incidents in the world. A new dimension to this inequality is that it is no longer simply black and white, a black and white matter, but rather a class issue, as some blacks have climbed the socioeconomic ladder. Still, an overwhelming majority lives in abject poverty. It is this socioeconomic struggle that Mandela referred to in his 100-day speech in August 1994. At the end of the day, I quote, "The yardstick that we shall be judged by is one and only one, and that is, are we, through our endeavors here, creating the basis to better the lives of South Africans? This is not because the people have some subjective expectations framed during an election campaign. Neither is it because there is a magic wand that they see in the new government. Millions have suffered deprivation for decades, and they have the right to seek redress. They fought and voted for change, and change the people of South Africa must have." I will end this talk with Mandela's last public speech delivered in June 2004. In 1998, Mandela retired after being president after only 4 years. And then in 2004, he announced that he was retiring from public life. So he said, "When I told one of my advisors a few months ago that I wanted to retire, he growled at me, 'You are retired?' If that is really the case, then I should say, I now announce that I'm retiring from retirement. I do not intend to hide away from the public, but henceforth, I want to be in a position of calling you to ask whether I will be welcome, rather than being called upon to do things and participate in events. The appeal, therefore, don't call me, I will call you." So what have we learned from Mandela, the man who became the global icon? First, if all the African leaders and leaders throughout the world had the Mandela humility, not to overstay their welcome in office and not to abuse their power, what a world it would be. But beyond that, what we can learn from Mandela can be summarized in a few words: equality and justice, courage, fearlessness, humility, perseverance, compassion, empathy, the importance of fighting and negotiating for a good cause, forgiveness, openness, reconciliation, pragmatism, and unity. It is because Mandela was such a unifying symbol between races and between ethnicities that many feared that unprecedented violence would erupt following his death in December 2013. And then, of course, there is the gift of smiling and laughter that is well known for throughout the world. I mean, for someone who was sentenced to jail for 27 years for asking to be treated as a fellow human being, the man was definitely not vengeful. With all or some of these, we can all be little Mandelas, and the possibilities will be limitless for South Africa and the world at large. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy. Our second speaker is Dr. Diana Bryden. Dr. Bryden is Director of the Center for Globalization and Cultural Studies here at the university, holds a Canada Research Chair in Globalization and Cultural Studies, is a professor in the Department of English, Film, and Theatre. Diana has published widely on Canadian and post-colonial literary studies and how communities are adjusting to globalizing processes. Her books include Decolonizing Fictions, Shakespeare in Canada, Renegotiating Community, and Crosstalk, Canadian and Global Imaginaries in Dialogue. She studies how national and global imaginaries are changing, how they're interconnected, and what they mean for Canadian culture and research. Her research brings her in direct contact with peoples who are experiencing ethnic and cultural discrimination and is able to provide us with a snapshot of current global realities. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Diana Bryden.
To Joy's list, I'll add that we've also learned from Mandela a willingness to listen and negotiate, a commitment to the dignity and full personhood of all, and a willingness to put the larger public good above personal interests. He reminds us that democracy is an ongoing process that needs to be both exercised and defended. So some of you may be asking, why is a white woman standing up there talking to us about race? My answer is that the history of race relations impacts us all, and we all need to take responsibility for them, for what we have inherited and for what we do now. I began my career by looking to Australia for ways to understand Canada. Growing up in Hamilton, Ontario, I could see how class, religious, sexual, and racial oppression were linked and affected most dimensions of our everyday lives. I began to think about what it might mean to live in a settler colonial society in which Indigenous peoples were marginalized and stereotyped, and their history and cultural achievements denied. So I looked to Australia and other colonized countries for a way of understanding that history, because we need to know our past to avoid repeating it. I turned to literature to find alternative forms of remembering and creative ways to move forward. So my work now asks how we can learn to see difference as a positive contribution to national resiliency and global survival. National community needs to be reimagined beyond defensive and fearful reactions against others. Mandela began to show us how. Appeals to race, ethnicity, and culture often function as the excuse for exercising economic control. The British ruled their empire through a policy of divide and conquer. So as someone who specializes in the links connecting colonialism, racism, and globalization, I'm just going to throw out a few points as openings for further discussion. One, how we talk about race matters. I speak of people as racialized rather than belonging to a particular race. When we understand that racism is a system for managing populations and making sense of the world, it's easier to resist claims that locate racism in the individual or nature alone. Of course, individuals can internalize racist beliefs, but they may be encouraged or discouraged from doing so by larger societal forces, including the media, government, and schools. So two, race has a history. One form of racialized thinking depends on chromatism, categorizing people on the basis of skin color. It can seem natural, yet that can be deceiving. In North America, groups now considered white were once categorized as black. I'm thinking of the Irish and the Ukrainians, for example. Quebecers who spoke French in the mid-20th century were told, speak white. So 3, race thinking sees whiteness as the norm for the fully human, so that white people are just human, while people from other places are categorized according to race, or increasingly by ethnicity, culture, or civilization. One problem these terms share is seeing individual people in terms of homogeneous categories, as if all members of a group share certain tendencies. In this system, only white people retain the privilege of choosing their affiliations. Others are seen as trapped by their race. Critical whiteness studies is a field that explores this problem of white privilege. So 4, constructions of blackness today have been heavily influenced by the struggles of black people in South Africa and in the Americas against legislated apartheid slavery systems that exploited their labor. We need to know that history, and we need to address it, but we also need to be careful about how it is used. I support the current CARICOM legal initiative to seek reparations for the Atlantic slave trade, because the effects of that trade continue today. But if we think the Atlantic slave trade is over, it's something we can deplore from our position in a more enlightened presence, then it's harder to see its continuing impact today. It's also harder to see the ways in which contemporary forms of slavery still exist. Insofar as globalization encourages the exploitation and trafficking of people, it also encourages new forms of slavery. So 5, the media encourages attention to spectacular violence. What about the slow violence of new forms of slavery, gradual human rights restrictions, grinding poverty, and environmental degradation? 6, racism is produced by the decisions we make as a community and at all levels of our coexistence. It's too easy to forget the legislated restrictions on the lives of colonized peoples under colonialism. Critical race philosophers call this form of forgetting epistemological ignorance. The point here is that ignorance can be taught and rewarded. So race thinking thrives in times of financial crisis, insecurity, and rapid change. New racisms are coalescing around immigration and refugee policies and leading to the creation of spaces in which human rights are suspended. Guantanamo Bay, Australia's island spaces where refugees are incarcerated indefinitely. Hostility to immigration is on the rise globally. So what can we do? Apartheid was a system of legislated racism. We need to ask, what forms of legislated racism are in place today? What forms of sanctioned ignorance support them? What might Canadian forms of ethical internationalism involve?
Thank you, Diana. Our final speaker is Mr. Rai Morin, the director of the National Research Center for Truth and Reconciliation at the University of Manitoba. This new research center will be the national repository for audio, video, archival documents, art, artifacts, and photographs collected as expressions of reconciliation presented at Truth and Reconciliation Commission events. Rai is working with Aboriginal communities and survivor organizations, governments, partners, external agencies, and university departments to fully establish the center. Since 2010, he's been the director of statement gathering with the Commission. He previously owned Yellow Tilt Productions, delivering professional services in a variety of areas, including Aboriginal language preservation. He's a member of the Métis Nation and holds a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Victoria. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Rai Morin.
Well, good evening. Nelson Mandela is known for many things, but perhaps he is most importantly known for his embrace of dialogue and for following 3 simple but powerful rules: free yourself, free others, and serve every day. Mandela had the ability to create a space for conversation between parties of deeply divergent opinion. The Nelson Mandela Foundation, one of the many international supporters of the university's National Research Center for Truth and Reconciliation, continues on in this work, stating that dialogue is at once a vital instrument for addressing critical social issues, as is the most effective vehicle for sharing memory, for growing it, and for engaging in the promotion of justice and social cohesion. We in Canada now live in an era of reconciliation, an era that commenced with the apology made in 2008 by the leaders of the political parties and delivered in the House of Commons on behalf of all Canadians. We live in this area that sees Canadian society taking the first faltering steps towards reconciliation. And as we journey along this path, the barrier will continue to present itself, and that barrier is one of truth. We are a nation of recovering colonialists, a nation that in pursuit of its own agendas has left behind it a wake of degraded forests, polluted waters, critically endangered Aboriginal languages, and sowed deep mistrust between it and the Aboriginal peoples of this land. We in Canada are not immune to failure. We are not immune to racism, and we are not immune to conducting mass human rights atrocities. We have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in this country for real and legitimate reasons. A recent grant program announced by the U.S. Agency for International Development reads that calls for truth and reconciliation arise from countries where legacies of gross human rights violations cast a shadow on transitions from repressive regimes to participatory and democratic forms of governance. Impunity and lack of accountability perpetuate the legacy of a painful past, exacerbate the fragility of peace and reconciliation processes, and obstruct the development of a democratic society. And we ask, is this the Canada we know? Is this the Canada that is being taught about in our schools, the one we promote abroad? If you are an Aboriginal person living in this country, the Canada you know is not the same Canada as is recited time and time again in the teachings of our colonial legacy. The symptoms of this colonial binge remain everywhere, from the over-incarceration of Aboriginal peoples, the high suicide rates, the lack of clean drinking water, the lower life expectancy, low voter turnout rates, and the ongoing struggles for justice for missing and murdered Aboriginal women. To be fair, not all is bleak. More and more Aboriginal people are entering the education system, and this particular institution here is doing its absolute best to make sure that Aboriginal students have a welcoming and supported experience as they undertake their studies. Thousands of survivors of the residential schools have shown unbelievable courage and strength, determination in the sharing of their experiences in an effort to educate Canadians about the legacy and impacts of those schools. Prominent Aboriginal peoples can now be found in all sectors of the economy, including law, medicine, social work, music, business, to mention but a few. But this is not enough. Returning to Mandela's 3 rules: free yourself, free others, serve every day. In order to truly embrace these lessons of Mandela, to free Canada from its colonial past, we have to be open to the truth, to the history of this country, to the reality of lives of Aboriginal people within this country. We have to abandon conventional ways of looking at the past and conventional ways of thought. We have to challenge ourselves to dismiss old myths dominant in Canadian society and learn to accept new traditions and new perspectives. We have to know and deeply understand with laser-sharp detail exactly what attitudes were referred to when Prime Minister Harper stated, "There is no place in Canada for the attitudes that inspired the Indian residential school system to ever again prevail." If we are to embrace Mandela's teachings, we must create a new shared history, one that should and must deconstruct what we think of this country, and one that must incorporate Aboriginal peoples as equals. Unless we unpack our own colonial identities, we will be unable to truly free this country from its colonial past. One cannot understand reconciliation if one is unable to hear the truth, and as Wab Kinew recently stated, reconciliation simply is not a second chance at assimilation.
Thank you, Rai. So we'll now come to the question and answer discussion section of the evening. There's been lots said, I think, that people will want to respond to or add to. I mentioned at the beginning of the evening that we're working with CBC, and this partnership helps us to bring our visionary conversation discussion to a larger audience and to continue the conversation beyond this evening. So before looking to a member of the audience, I want to give an opportunity for Terry McLeod to ask a question from the CBC's social media followers.
Thank you, Dr. Barnard. I'm curious to ask to all of the panelists, in what ways was Mandela's message heard in post-colonial communities outside of South Africa? I mean, here in North America, but elsewhere across Africa, in South America, in indigenous communities, in Zimbabwe, in many of the other communities that we look to as ones that are now post-colonial.
Should we take that in order of speakers? Joy, do you want to start?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Speaking about post-colonial Africa and Zimbabwe in particular, I don't know whether we can actually say that the message has been heard, because I'm sure most people are aware of what has been going on is exactly the opposite of what Mandela was talking about. And part of the reason why the white community is still afraid in South Africa is because what has been happening in Zimbabwe, particularly the farm invasions, and the way that, generally speaking, the government has messed up the economy. So there's always this fear that, South Africa will eventually go the Zimbabwean way. And so I can't really say that the message has been embraced. But, at the very beginning, Robert Mugabe talked a lot about reconciliation. And it kind of worked for some time. And then by 1990, because, people began to feel that the promises that had been made at independence had not been delivered, land became a thing that he grabbed onto, to keep the people in line, so to speak. He rubber-stamped the farm invasions that were started by the peasants who wanted him to address the colonial imbalances, particularly regarding to the land issue, which is why for South Africa it's in a very delicate position right now, because without addressing those apartheid imbalances, anything is possible.
Diana?
Okay, well, I think at the time, after the Rivonia speech, and when he was incarcerated, he meant a lot to people in the Caribbean. They felt huge pride in this figure who was showing so much leadership and so much dignity, and they felt a sense of racial solidarity, and a sense that their humanity was being recognized. And there are some wonderful poems that have come out of the Caribbean from that time, actually making fun of the ineptitude of the white apartheid regime, at one time going into Winnie Mandela's house when she was under house arrest and arresting her bedspread because it was in the banned ANC colors. In Sweden, I know the trade union movement worked very closely with the trade union movement throughout the period of apartheid, to try to make Mandela's vision a reality. But I was talking to someone who was in South Africa just recently, and we were talking about what trade unionist civil society groups were reading in their own self-study groups now. And he said they're reading Frantz Fanon. They're reading The Wretched of the Earth, because Fanon's message is what happens after you win self-rule. What happens when you have your own government? You have to be careful that it's not taken over by a capitalist class and the poverty of the masses is just continued. So it's Fanon's message at the moment, I think, that is resonating perhaps a little more.
Right.
Yeah, I think we can think of Mandela's legacy and what he's known for in a couple different ways, from the specific or to the general, and I think I'll talk about the general. I think Mandela's gift to the world is that he is a global role model, and he's known to be a person that fought the good fight, the fight for the little guy and the fight for basic human rights and human decency. And I think you don't need to know a lot about Mandela to know that that was one of his primary motivators in life. And that is a huge gift. We need those kind of role models. And we need those kind of people to grace this planet and to show us how to aspire to be more than we are.
The question is, what have we learned from Nelson Mandela? A simple one-word answer: reconciliation. Having interacted with Mahatma Gandhi personally during the mid-1940s and with Martin Luther King Jr. in the 60s, early 60s, during the epic Boston March, the thing that I find that is common amongst these three stalwarts of the world is one word: reconciliation. People had to fight against the British in India politically, in South Africa against apartheid, and in the southern United States particularly. In all these instances, the message of nonviolence, the message of reconciliation is the only way through which we can get true reconciliation and progress in understanding. And over here, in terms of the problems of our First Nations, we found people like Justice Sinclair and what he has been doing as the president of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission comes very close to this ideal propounded by Nelson Mandela.
Thank you, President Barnard, for your leadership again, and the speakers. I always learn from these visionary conversations. For tonight, for example, I learned that I'm both black and white. And did you know that Barack Obama, his mother was Ukrainian, and so his first name is Burak, and he made borscht out of McCain and his recent opponent. Now, serious question now. There's in the media, I see some, I don't know if it's international or particular groups that are trying to get a lawsuit against Britain for slavery. Can anyone expand on that, please? Thank you.
Diana?
Well, I raised that. It's actually CARICOM, which represents the Caribbean nations. And there was an article in The Guardian about 2 days ago about this lawsuit. It's not just against the British. It's against a number of European nations who were involved in the slave trade. And to my surprise, it includes Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. I hadn't realized about their involvement as well. So this is a court case that is going forward. And the article also points out that Prime Minister Cameron and his wife both come from families that also profited from the slave trade. But the case at the moment is against the governments of these European nations.
Thank you. Joy?
Let me just add that in addition to this lawsuit over slavery, there's also a lawsuit against the British about the Mau Mau War in Kenya in the 1950s, where the British officials in Kenya committed a lot of atrocities against African inmates. People who were arrested because they either support or were or allegedly supported the Mau Mau, and it's another court case that's going on.
And it's the same law firm in both cases.
Yeah.
Question at the back?
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I would like to begin by saying that it's logical that if there was no apartheid, there would probably have been no Nelson Mandela. We probably would not have heard about this globally celebrated freedom fighter. He probably would have just lived his life in Johannesburg and just work as a lawyer and retire. Okay, so I am wondering about the role that struggles in the society play in making sure that people leave a legacy. And moving away slightly from the apartheid struggle and the message of reconciliation that Mandela preached, I would like to focus on his voluntary handover of power after just one term. And then comparing that to some sit-tight African leaders who have perennially failed to deliver the dividends of democratic rule to their societies. Now, since 2007, that's about 7 years ago, the Mo Ibrahim Foundation has established this prize for African leadership, where every African leader who successfully delivered health, education, and other dividends of democracy to the people would, upon leaving office, win a prize of $5 million and then be placed on a yearly salary of $200,000. So you would think that people, leaders in Africa, will be jostling for this prize. But then, for 7 years, we've only had like 3 winners. In some years, there have been no winner at all, even no nominee. So, what role does the African society play as a role, as a whole, in holding up their leaders to such standards set by Mandela and to making sure that they indeed leave a legacy? Does society play any role? Again, remembering that if there was no apartheid, there would have been no Mandela. Thank you.
Thank you. Joy, do you want to start?
Okay. Let me start off by responding to the point that you raised about Mandela retiring from office after one term, and how Africans, whether African societies are holding their leaders accountable. You see, the problem with that is, as long as there's no democracy, people don't have ways and means to hold their leaders accountable. Because if you don't have the right to speak, if you do, you get arrested, you're thrown into prison, you disappear, or whatever happens, then you don't have a means with which to hold leaders accountable. So it is largely because leaders who overlive their welcome use force. It is about force that they continue to stay in power. When there is force, there is hardly anything that people can do, because you can die, you can disappear, or whatever. And it's part of the reason why some leaders on the continent have been able to stay in power, sometimes for over 30 years.
Okay, right.
One of the things that is a reality as well with the impact of the residential school system is the impact of intergenerational trauma. And when you have terrible things that happen to people, it affects them deeply, and especially when that's done to children, there's very real effects to that. And that's one of the legacies that continues to play itself out today in this very country, is these ongoing effects of what was done to kids in the 40s and the 50s and 60s, and the last school closed in 1996. So, I wonder, if that also doesn't apply to other nation states as well. I mean, where there is war, where there is violence, where there is suppression, when the society itself is living in this state of trauma, those intergenerational effects must be there, and they must affect the society the same way that we see it happening here. It's just the cultural interpretation of that might be slightly different based on the situational circumstance, but yeah.
Yeah, I'd just add that I think that is part of the argument that CARICOM is making, that those legacies of slavery in the case of the Caribbean can still be observed in the society today, because that trauma works itself out in dysfunctional ways. At the same time, too, I'd point out that there's a phrase that was popular in the 60s, but that I think still holds true: the development of underdevelopment. The way in which great riches were stolen from these countries through the imperial era, the riches of people from Africa, for example, huge numbers of people, at least 14 million, but also resources. At one time in history, Guadeloupe was worth more than Canada to the European powers that owned both places. So I think that's part of that history that we need to come to terms with as well, that underdevelopment has actually been consciously developed by policies taken throughout history. So the question you're asking is a really hard question we all need to grapple with. What do we do now?
So can I just ask a variant on that, or a follow-on question? Even with all of the goodwill that's generated by examples like Mandela, there is the tremendous social inertia of these realities that have been created. What observations might any of you have on places where there has been success in dealing with that kind of social inertia to make substantial and lasting change, or are we still learning how to do that?
I might be able to speak at a sort of a micro level, what we've seen here in Canada at least. When we were conducting our work as a commission, we would have to visit many communities, and these communities have been affected in different ways by the residential school system. The one community that I'm thinking of in particular is the Port Alberni community out on Vancouver Island, and we would go into a community and we would hold a hearing, and we would ask people if they wanted to speak to us and tell us their stories. And we were absolutely overwhelmed with the number of people who wanted to talk to us in that community. And part of the reason for that is they, as a community, had been talking together for a long time and working through some of the hardship that had happened in that community. That was one of the spots where the litigation started against some of the perpetrators in the residential schools. They, as a community, pulled together, and the broader community around there had pulled together, and they had worked through a lot of the tough issues. And that community was so much different than the communities that weren't talking to one another, and where they weren't able to talk to it for whatever about it, and either for shame or for issues of violence still in the communities or everything like that. It was much harder for those communities that weren't talking to talk to us and to start that journey of healing.
Thanks.
Yeah, I would add to that there's an amazing woman in Jamaica, Erna Broadber, who is a novelist and storyteller, but who lives in a small community in Jamaica and has been working for years with that community just to instill some pride in who they are, some pride in their heritage, and particularly to help the young black boys and black men, develop a sense of dignity and worth, to help them find ways in which they can live their lives more creatively together. And I think of the example of Ngugi wa Thiong'o in Kenya, who the first time that he wrote a play in his own language had thousands of people take part in a communal celebration of who they were. And that was the first time the government took notice of him. He'd been writing in English for quite a while. That was the first time the government threw him in jail, because he was reaching out to the community and beginning to make a democratic difference as people began to talk to each other about what they might do together.
Joy, any comment?
In South Africa, there have been organizations at grassroots level where people get together and talk about their experiences in apartheid, and where people also try to forge some networks which they use to improve their own communities, rather than simply waiting for the state to introduce or change from above. There's been some change from below too.
Oh, can I add one thing to that quickly? Just like Shack Dwellers, South Africa is an amazing group that works, in the slums for people just to get together and build their own home. And they say, we're not going to wait on the government. And they formed a group that has alliances with people throughout the world. Shack Dwellers International has branches in India and I think in Brazil as well. So these examples, I think, in Brazil, the landless workers movement is another good example of that kind of thing. So thanks, Joy.
Here?
I was in South Africa in the past year, And I was struck by many things, and one of the things I was struck by was the number of people that still live in shanty towns. I was told it's about 60%. And most of those people, of course, don't have running water, electricity, sewage. Yet the whites, on the other hand, you look at the way they live, they have mansions, walls around them. Many have signs like, expect a armed response. And I was also told that it's the greatest inequality in Africa is in South Africa, the richest country in Africa. So given all that, I would ask, is Nelson Mandela a failure? If he's not a failure, did he make mistakes? And can we learn something from his mistakes too?
Joy, do you want to start?
Yeah, Nelson Mandela himself always reminded people that he was not a messiah, that he could not have solutions for everything. And his biggest role probably was to make sure that South Africa has a smooth transition from apartheid to democracy. While it was not so smooth because of the black and black violence that took place in the years leading to the 1994 elections, it was way better than people anticipated. But at the same time, the inequalities among South Africans had been entrenched for centuries, because inequality did not begin with apartheid in 1948. It began in 1652 when the Dutch settled in South Africa. So you have centuries of inequality in which blacks are denied rights, are denied services, etc., etc. And then you have majority rule in 1994. You cannot change that overnight. And it becomes worse in a country where the black people have the political power but no economic power. How do you reverse the colonial and apartheid imbalances when you don't have the resources to do that? And when the South African society is still more or less like what it was prior to 1994 in terms of inequality, in terms of who is living where. There's been a small number of black people who have moved into white neighborhoods. But like when you're looking at the spatial organization of the urban landscape in South Africa, the blacks, an overwhelming majority of the blacks are still living where apartheid told them to live. The whites are still living in nice and posh suburbs. And how does the South African government, address that imbalance when they don't have the resources, and when those who don't have the resources, don't want to share? That's the biggest hurdle that South Africa is right now. And now the problem now is when you have people who are beginning to become radical about what should be done to have this change take place, it becomes a serious problem.
Any other observations? No? Question here?
I did have a question, and it's sort of, the answers seem to be emerging, but it continues to also to be a question. All the countries have gone through this struggle. One person emerges struggling and pointing out the inherent problems within its society, and then another happening. Every time it's happening, you realize that it's happening a little too often. Too many groups of people are being or suffering, or in some human rights manner, they have had some history. Why this history is being repeated? Anywhere, any other problem, a technological problem, we fix it, we no longer face that as a historical. It's more like a archival thing. You don't face it continuously. Somewhere else, another problem, a fire is here, you look at it, but in a social, humanistic way. We don't seem to look at our history, learn from it, and go on. So my question was emerging as, do you, in all your studies and in your reflection of this topic, or any one of us, do we have a sense of hope here? And then, David, when you asked that question, you started answering that a little bit. That made me feel maybe so. Maybe that is what is needed. more of us should start witnessing and expressing where all this is getting to be corrected, so that economically it made a difference, socially it made a difference, culturally it made a difference, and each group, if we can stand up and do say that, then maybe we all will feel more encouraged and thereby do more of that. I did go to South Africa. I visited their apartheid museum. Then I knew how the people suffered. We all need to be educated more so that we will correct more. So keep answering those questions and telling us where all it worked so that we can feel more encouraged.
Great, thank you. Any reaction, Ryan?
I would just, to the question about did Mandela fail and that, and responding to your point, I mean, I think the good thing about Mandela and people like Mandela is they're a wake-up call, because certainly human rights issues are present everywhere and they're an ongoing issue. But the problem with old patterns of behavior, as say colonial behavior, for example, it's like an old comfortable coat that you just kind of put on, you don't really even know what's on. And you don't necessarily know where the next coat is to grab. It's so comfortable, and you just tend to slip into the old behaviors. And the challenge, I think, when we're looking at this sort of transformative change for reconciliation is really starting to take apart that coat and just ripping it all up so you just can't even put it on anymore. Because that's the trick, is it's so easy to fall into old patterns. And the patterns themselves are insidious because we've built national identities, and it's this kind of, we keep these myths alive. We keep telling themselves to ourselves over and over again. And they're big hurdles to get over, because there's structural problems. There's the whole inequality of wealth is one of the major impacts of this. And it's hard to do something when you don't have the money in order to do it. It's hard to make the changes that you need to do. And meanwhile, the people on the dominance are going around walking in their nice coat, and it's very comfortable. And it's hard to change, so.
Mm-hmm. And sorry, go ahead.
The other question perhaps that we need to ask ourselves is, who reconciled? We talk about reconciliation. There is reconciliation that. Who reconciled? And that will help us understand why South Africa is in the state that it is right now, and why all the other former settler states are in the state in which they are right now.
So I would just say that I think education can make a difference. And in that respect, one of the good news stories is what the Brazilian government has been doing for the last 6 years or so in giving the Bolsa Familia, in actually paying poor families if they send their children to school. So they are educating their population so that they can get the jobs to make the economy work. And they've brought enormous numbers of people out of poverty already, so they are no longer one of the most unequal societies in the world. And one of the points Joy made to me when we were talking about this beforehand is that many young people in South Africa during the apartheid struggle refused to go to school because the schools were instruments of oppression. And now those young people find themselves uneducated and unable to get jobs. And the state is not doing anything to help them, but it could and it should.
If I may, just an observation on this. I think that part of the issue is that, as to use your image of the coat, we really need to tear up the old one so we can't put it back on and make something new. And it's difficult, I think, for individuals to bring that about. And when we see examples of leadership that move in that direction, symbolically of tearing something up and putting something new in place, I think we should celebrate them. And if I could just observe, and I don't mean this as a partisan political comment at all, I think that the recent historically significant movement by the Canadian government to give Indian communities control of their own education is an example of leadership in the direction, I think, to address exactly what you've mentioned. I think Richard Atleo was here. He and I were both present when the Prime Minister made that announcement a few weeks ago in Lethbridge. That's something that I think many of us in the country have thought has been too long coming. but it's a change that can address some of these fundamental issues, right? It seems to me. Any want to react to that? Question up here or comment?
Thank you. I think this panel is timely for a number of reasons, including that next week is the anti-apartheid week based on Israeli policies towards Palestine. And that anti-apartheid and boycott, divestment, and sanction movement is based on the South African movement. It has a lot of support from current South African leaders, including Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And of course, Nelson Mandela was very vocal about his support for the need for freedom for Palestinians. And I understand that the University of Manitoba has in fact banned the student group that was speaking out against Israeli apartheid. And so I'd be interested in hearing the panelists' thoughts about how we as Canadians can work together and how the University of Manitoba can support the growing global boycott, divestment, and sanction movement on this very difficult issue that when you speak out against it, you're very often labeled one way or another. But this movement is in fact based very strongly on the South African movement led by Mandela.
So can I just correct an error of fact in your statement of the question? The University of Manitoba has not outlawed any student group. There was a student group that previously had been endorsed, given the privileges of student groups, by the University of Manitoba Student Association. And the Student Association decided to take that endorsement back. Not a decision made by the university. Response to the question? Anyone?
Well, I think that this is a very, very difficult issue. I think that Israel is also a settler colony, though in a different way than we are. I think that I personally am not in favor of boycotts. I think that Mandela's message was one of dialogue, having difficult conversations, trying to talk things through. It takes a long time. I think it has to be started. I think you can't shut one group who's part of that necessary conversation out of the dialogue, though. I think that a lot more thinking needs to go into that area, and I think that to talk about it, yeah, I suppose that's all I'll say for now. But you need to keep talking.
Right.
I think I can echo that too. I mean, in my understanding of Mandela's approach and his pursuit of dialogue and the pursuit that continues in his name via the foundation, they seek to create those spaces in which those extraordinarily difficult conversations can occur. Those ones of an extremely polarized nature, where there's two sides that are both right in their own minds. And I think, you know, Mandela's approach there is one that that enables difficult conversation to occur. And, you know, I was talking to the fellow down there a little while ago, and he said, you know, when you got two people on the same side talking in the same room, that's not dialogue, that's just conversation or something like that. You need those polarized sides to come together in a spirit of respectful acknowledgement and vulnerability and truth and search for that in order to create movement in these really polarized circumstances. And the challenge is when things become, I think, extremely polarized, it's hard to create those spaces, and sometimes it takes real great leadership in order to just pull the people, even to get them to be vulnerable enough to start opening up, because there is a degree of vulnerability with truth.
Hello. The word that we get from here is reconciliation. And if we look at the South African situation, that reconciliation will be in vain if the current leadership does not take over from where Mandela left. And in that process, what they need is economic empowerment. We know that it is difficult for the current government to give the blacks economic power, but they have a resource on which they are currently sitting that they can use to turn things around, and that is the land. I believe and hope that the South Africans learned from Zimbabwe on how not to handle the land situation. And I also hope that they are learning a little bit from the Canadian situation. It's not a perfect situation on how the Canadian government and Aboriginal people are handling the land, but it is a workable situation. If I can quote from a writing from the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, it says, Canada is a test case for a grand notion. The notion that dissimilar peoples can share lands, power, and dreams while respecting and sustaining their differences. So the people in South Africa can share the land while still respecting their differences. Everything else might be difficult to put on track in terms of economic empowerment, but land is a simple issue on which to start.
Joy, you want to respond to that?
All right. Okay. Land. They are sitting on land. The land in South Africa, at least farming land, is largely owned by white people, and it does not belong to the government. If they have to redistribute land, they can only get it on a willing buyer, willing seller basis. They don't have the money to do that. So how are they going to, reverse that imbalance? And then the reconciliation, we keep talking about reconciliation, and earlier I asked it, who reconciliated? I'll give an example of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was established by the Mandela regime from 1996 to 1998. Very few white South Africans came forward with the atrocities that they committed. And yet it's common knowledge of the extensive number of atrocities committed by the apartheid machinery. A big majority of people who came forward to the TRSC were blacks. Granted, they also committed atrocities, but in the true spirit of reconciliation and in the true spirit of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, to have just a handful of white people come forward, again, it tells us a lot about what's going on about reconciliation in South Africa. And as long as the land does not belong to the state, they are sitting on it, but they don't have access to it. They cannot redistribute it. So, the South African government is in a serious bind.
Any observations, right?
I think land is also, it remains an unsettled question very much in here in Canada as well. There is much controversy and many unsettled issues that remain. And, I was speaking with some folks yesterday, and I mean, there's this real problem with BC. BC there's no signed treaties, or there's very few signed treaties now. There's a handful of signed treaties, but basically that is unceded Aboriginal land, according to the Royal Proclamation. So, this is a major unresolved issue that we have in our country, and it's one that actually isn't going away anytime soon. And put that on top. I mean, it's even in RCAP, some of the stuff that was talked about is about the forced relocations of people off their land as well, and that was part of the other dynamic. Land kind of is one of the real battlegrounds of reconciliation, because that's when people's interests really come into play. And that's where, when you look at our country and our nation state, and you look at our economic base, what's the famous quote? We are a nation of hewers of wood and drawers of water and miners of minerals, right? I mean, this is where the issues really remain, and will continue to remain for a while.
Thank you. Up here?
Well, I just want to find out if at all the minority who are the white, the minority rich, who are the white people in South Africa, have taken any initiative of trying to reconcile with the majority blacks who have very little, in order to quench the discontent of the blacks, so that the situation does not slip off into the likeness of Zimbabwe. Thank you.
Thank you. John?
I'm not familiar with anything that is going on right now regarding whether there have been, for example, some white farmers who have offered, to give land to the state. But what I have come across is how some young blacks, unemployed, have begun to take the law into their own hands, and they've been going into white commercial farms, and there's been a spate of killings of white farmers. Since 1995, I think over almost 4,000 farmers have been killed. And already that in itself is telling of the wrong direction in which things are going. But on an individual level, there have been some individual wise who have been very helpful to some black people.
Thank you. Terry, can we get another question from you?
I'm curious as to what you think about some of the compromises that Mandela made. His continuing negotiations with the owners of the very large mines in South Africa in the lead up to the transformation of the country meant that the mines were not nationalized, the gold mines, the diamond mines. And I'm wondering whether you look at that now and say that might have been an error. What do you think?
Personally, I think Mandela was actually very pragmatic about the whole thing, because we should look to history to see what the best way forward Mandela could have taken. In Mozambique, in 1975, when the country became independent, Samora Machel was the first president of the country, was a hardline Marxist. And what did the Portuguese do? They destroyed industrial plants, they destroyed buildings, they destroyed bridges, communication lines. The country was ransacked by the Portuguese when they were leaving. And then you look at Zimbabwe, we started off with a reconciliation policy. And after some time, Mugabe realized that it was only him and the ZANU-PF government which had reconciled. The whites had not reconciled. And they actually started calling names. If we had known that it was only political power that you wanted, we would have given it to you a long time ago. And then he turned against them. So Mandela, I don't think he had much of a room to maneuver, because a lot was at stake here. If he had gone ahead with nationalizing the mines, there was going to be extensive flight capital from South Africa, because in the years leading to the 1994 elections, there were already threats by South African capital. There was a lot of externalization of funds by some companies. And there were these threats: if you do this, we are leaving. And then the country would have crumbled to its knees. So personally, I think Mandela was very pragmatic by deciding to negotiate with these companies. It could have been much worse than it is right now.
Thank you. Here, Chris?
About injustices, and it seems we head towards a model of reconciliation. In the context perhaps of South Africa or other countries, I wonder if you could comment on reconciliation and how you avoid revenge and bitterness, and perhaps has that been solved, or it's just simmering to rise up in the future?
I can make some observations on that, at least for this particular context that we have in Canada here. And this was a conversation that I was having with somebody this morning, actually, and I was remarking at the amazing peace that we have in this country, and the peace that we have in between Aboriginal peoples. And I think if we use the example of the New Channel Tribal Council on the west side of Vancouver Island as an example, I mean, it wasn't that long ago where there was active war happening between some of the communities. 150 years ago, there was active war. And now there is a tribal council of 13 communities that have come together and speak as one voice, more or less, politically. There was a lot of violence in this country once upon a time, and those aspects of violence have largely disappeared. And I think that is something that is reassuring in the sense that Aboriginal peoples have been working together for a long time now, and that they've demonstrated a lot of amazing capacity for peace in this country. And that's something that is actually sometimes, I think, not remembered enough, the accomplishments that have been made.
Let me try to answer that with a story. When Mandela died, when there was that national funeral where a lot of leaders gathered, Jacob Zuma stood up to talk, and he was booed. Then Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe stood up and talked, and people clapped in the stadium. What does that tell us?
Diana, did you want to?
I think it depends on the quality of the reconciliation, how genuine it is, how much real listening and then real change based on that listening happens, whether that coat gets thrown off or not. I think, though, that it will be slow. I think the pragmatic approach that Mandela took, the willingness to compromise, is the way you move toward peace, but it takes two sides to do it, and we don't always have two sides willing. As Joy pointed out, one side initially had to give up a lot more, had to make a lot more compromises, and because of Mandela's leadership, they were willing to do that. And we certainly could use more of that in other situations around the world. But I think reconciliation is in danger of becoming a word that's seen as an alibi for the status quo if it's not engaged in very, very seriously by all people involved in this country and in the other countries around the world that also need this kind of reconciliation to move forward.
I think we talked about that, that little bit, that institutional violence that happens just by not changing that status quo. Like, the suppression of rights and economic liberty and freedom and all that sort of stuff that comes by being subjugated, that is a form of violence in and of itself, and that's something that happens if the status quo is maintained. So there's I think the issue is that reconciliation is a two-way street for sure, but it does mean not the status quo. Yeah.
Yeah, and let's also remember that, this is not just about South Africa, it's about Africa as a continent. Because, throughout the continent, it's not the Africans who own and control the resources. So it's very hard for any meaningful development to take place when South Africa is probably the most resource-endowed continent, but the poorest.
Thank you. Right up here.
Hello. Okay. When one of the things, the questions that came up a long time ago was, what does Mandela mean? And I think, for me, what I find is that he gave power to the people who are trying to fight for something that they think is really important and right, and they are wrong. Because what we have to remember is that he was in jail. And there were a lot of people who were considered freaks who were fighting to free him. And when he came out and became the hero, that was a very strong reminder to the people who fight in these little corners, whether it's for gay rights or, as Wab Canoe keeps saying, those 825 missing and murdered Aboriginal women, or whether it's for justice for Aboriginal people, that if you keep it up, you will change what we see as the status quo. Someone also said, is there hope? And I look around the room, and I mean, I'm not that young, and I also have some historical memory. And I like to remind my students of this, is that at the beginning of the 1900s, most people on the planet were not considered human, right? We have come a long, long way. Right, we have come a long way in terms of women's rights, in terms of the rights and acknowledgement and understanding of what it is to be human, including for people who have various forms of disability. Right now, we're finally working on mental illness. Right, there's all kinds of dimensions in which we have come a long way. But what Mandela, I think, gave to us is the fact that you've got to keep persisting, because what is considered the status quo will change. And the people who were once freaks become the people who are, actually seen as making an obvious point. And the ones who are standing, against history, basically, get pushed to the side. One more thing that I have to say, because I've always wanted one area to say this, and I don't know a lot about Africa, although I've worked there and I have relatives there. But Kenneth Kaunda, to me, when I learned that he actually lost an election, that to me was the biggest move for democracy in Africa. Because stepping down is one thing, but allowing yourself, because in the context of Africa, I see it as allowing yourself to lose an election, to me is something that every African leader has to strive for, and that you have to be able to see repeated. So anyways, I'd like to know what you guys think about, my kind of take on what Mandela stood for.
Kenneth Kaunda losing the elections in Zambia was probably one of the benchmarks of the Zambian post-colonial history. But then again, we have to be careful, in that we don't eulogize just having an opposition winning an election. What does it do? I mean, what does the opposition do once they're in power? This is what matters. Because when Kenneth Kaunda left office, Chiluba got in. And in some senses, he was worse than Kenneth Kaunda. And he even tried to change the constitution so that he stays in power longer than what was allowed by the constitution. So, it is not just about the elections and the opposition winning, but more about changing the mindset. Yeah.
Chris?
Those of us who came here from the developing world, particularly from the continent of Africa, we escaped dictatorial regimes that trample upon basic human and democratic rights. And we consider ourselves, we made Canada home. After several years, there is a general consensus that many African countries are no better than what they were several years ago. That's what we feel right now. Do the panelists share this view, or do you think because the messages of Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi, and Nelson Mandela were spreading, Africa is in a better position now compared to, say, 15, 20 years ago?
In most cases, it's actually worse off. For a number of reasons. Part of the reason why in the 1970s, 60s, 70s, things were not that bad on the continent was partly because of the Cold War politics, in which African leaders, could, use the divide and rule tactics to get aid either from the East or from the West. And then in addition to that, you have now from the time that the Cold War ended, around about 1991, donor agencies and donor countries like the USA, the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, beginning to give aid with strings attached. We'll give you money, we'll give you whatever you want, as long as you introduce multi-party democracy. We'll give you money as long as you begin to stop subsidizing the poor people by giving them free health, by subsidizing their food, for subsidizing transport. We'll give you money if you privatize the businesses that are run by the state as parastatals. Indeed, these were the businesses that most ordinary and most poor people relied on in their day-to-day struggles to survive. And what did these IMF and the World Bank policies do? They threw most African states into a ditch. Things became worse. The kind of education that's now there, the economies, other social services. Right now, because of the HIV/AIDS pandemic, a lot of people in Africa are dying from a disease that can be controlled and people can survive for a very long time. Simply because IMF and World Bank had such policies. And also because of mismanagement, we have to face the facts, also that African leaders themselves had their part, the part that they contributed to this whole mess that Africa is in. Corruption, nepotism, in all of those things. And so Africa is worse off in most cases right now than it was. We have Nigeria, for example, a country that I think is the 4th largest producer of oil in the world. It produces the best quality oil in the world, #1. But people there cannot afford to pay for fuel, for gas. They have to go and make some holes on the pipelines to steal the gas. And what happens? It catches fire and thousands of people die. Africa now is suffering from hunger because they cannot produce enough to feed. The land that's available is being devoted to cash crops because governments want a source of foreign currency. There are all sorts of problems that are afflicting Africa right now, that it's actually worse off right now than it was in the 70s and 80s.
One of the other dynamics I think that we see in Africa, but really is playing out over the entire world too, is this the ongoing reality and dynamic of climate change, and that affecting many areas of Africa, water scarcity, desertification, so on and so forth. And we may very well ask ourselves the question, are we as a globe in better shape now than we were 30 years ago? And when you look at some of the realities of climate change and the massive smog cloud that was over Beijing, the worst air pollution that's ever been seen on the face of the planet, it all depends how you measure it, but boy oh boy, we got some big problems that we are not making a ton of progress on anytime quick, and that's a very scary situation.
Thank you. On the subject of Africa, on March the 27th, I would mention that a Dr. Makwagi from the Congo is going to be in Winnipeg. He'll be at the Playhouse Theatre, and he is quite an outstanding personality. He has built and operates a hospital called the Panzi Hospital in the Congo that deals with women that are suffering from war, the result of war attack for rape. Rape in the Congo is not illegal, there's no law against it, and it is absolutely used as a weapon of war. As a matter of fact, in our talks tonight, we haven't heard too much about the women's rights side as opposed to the men's rights side. I don't know if there are any women in the South African Parliament. I hope there are. But for those of you that are interested, it's the 27th of March at the Playhouse Theatre. I don't know the new name of it, too old to remember. So I thought I'd throw in that commercial, if you don't mind, Dr. Bernard.
Even if I mind, you threw it in. So. But I don't mind. Thank you. Great. Here.
Thank you. In the post-apartheid era, one of the actions of the government was to require the integration of universities. There would be no more black universities and no more white universities. University of Manitoba was asked to help out at a black university in this transition. And so I had the opportunity to go and to interact with two universities, mainly at the black university. The first thing that struck me was that neither of the two universities wanted to merge, but they were told by government that they would have to. What was interesting is they both decided, well, if this is what it's going to be, let's do it right and let's really commit ourselves to it. I was very impressed with the determination of the two universities to make it work. But they were starting from an incredible gap. The black university had very few professors who had PhDs, and they did not have a research culture. And so the task I was given was to answer the question or to help them to understand how to create a research culture in a university. And I just wonder if you have any understanding as to whether those kinds of initiatives are bearing fruit now and whether the integration of the universities is bearing fruit now.
It's not a subject that I'm very familiar with, but I can tell you that some universities have integrated. But still, most universities, it's particularly those which catered for the poor. An overwhelming majority of people who are still attending those universities are the poor, students from poor backgrounds, largely Africans. And at the same time, the kind of resources that you find in those universities, the vast difference between, University of KwaZulu-Natal, for instance, and maybe Wits, the University of Witwatersrand, huge, differences. Because, like I said, it's hard when you don't have the resources to change the culture overnight, to change the system overnight. And again, in the end, it depends on who has what to go where.
Thank you very much. I think I'll bring the conversation to an end here. And I really would like to thank all of you for your participation, and particularly to thank our panelists for their original comments and for the responses. And I'd like to apologize to my colleague Verna Kirkness. I mentioned that Richard Atleo and I were at the Lethbridge announcement, but in fact the University of Manitoba was disproportionately well represented there because Verna was there as a person who's been working a long time to provide educational opportunities for young people. I'd like to invite you to visit our Visionary Conversations website at umanitoba.ca/visionaryconversations for a new feature that's called After the Conversation. Over the next little while, we'll be uploading articles and studies and links to websites referenced in or related to tonight's conversation. And also to invite you to attend some other events happening on campus in the coming weeks. We're really excited to have Neil deGrasse Tyson on campus tomorrow and invite you to attend his free public lecture titled The Sky is Not the Limit, taking place at Investors Group Athletic Center. Doors open at 3 o'clock. The lecture runs from 4 to 5:15. He's an excellent lecturer. He's well known. The students are promoting this. If you want to come early to get a seat. I think it will be it'll be a very lively afternoon event. His reincarnation of the program Cosmos, formerly hosted by Carl Sagan, has just premiered this week. On April the 3rd, Mary Simon, chairperson of Canada's Task Force on Inuit Education, will be speaking as part of the Public Policy Forum here in this room at 5:30, a reception, lecture at 6, and her talk is titled Fulfilling National Arctic Interests and Obligations Through Education. And I also hope you'll join us here again on Wednesday, the 30th of April, for our final visionary conversation for this season. The topic is, should we have the right to die? The evolution of the rights culture. And our panelists for this discussion will be Harvey Chachanov, Mary Sharif, and Art Schaefer. Begins again at 6:30 with a reception and the panel discussion at 7 o'clock. Thank you very much.